strange, but obviously I didn't do it, but a magical moment.
All right, I'm done
Okay,
already.
yeah.
Wait.
Ah,
Something happened.
whoop.
It's already recording?
Yeah, sure.
Well, you can. Mm. Mm.
So this is a simple rooibos from South Africa.
Yeah.
With no,
I used to drink it all the time.
no
Yeah.
added.
Reminds me of my girlfriend.
Okay.
She introduced me to rooibos.
Okay.
Hmm.
She from South Africa?
Mm.
Yeah, South
Yeah.
Africa?
Yeah. Mm. Ah. Wow.
It's a beautiful April Saturday. I'm having as a guest Chris Lingle. He is in Bucharest. Yesterday he talked about uh, with the Free Market Roadshow. He had a speech on economic problems in the Senate room at the Parliament, and I have this occasion to have a chat, to share some tea, to share some of his ideas. First of all, Chris, I would like to talk a bit about you for people watching. So you are an educator and an economist. You have a PhD in economics and have wrote extensively on economic issues. I know that you have an expertise on Asia and a funny experience or interesting experience there. And you are this sort of popularizing globetrotter. So you've been in a lot of places with International Society for Individual Liberty, as I know, and now with the Free Market Roadshow. And I'm happy to welcome you to have this discussion. So being a discussion hosted by the Mises Institute, since I'm from the Mises Institute Romania, I would want to have this discussion on Austrian economics subjects, on Austrian economics issues, and let's start with money. Let's talk about monetary policy, and let's talk about crypto, because it's such a fashionable and relevant subject.
Yeah.
So what are your ideas about how what's the shape of future policy, and what's the shape of future markets, the future of money at an international level from this perspective?
Well, I'm honored to have my name associated with Mises, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm very pleased to be back in Bucharest and to see you again and so many of my other friends. So we could discuss these kind of topics. But the problem with central bank policy, as it is developed today around the world, is based upon a deeply flawed model. And that's a model based on monetarism, the modern quantity theory of money, which was championed by one of my heroes of libertarian ideas, Milton Friedman. But his influence in terms of economic policy has been, frankly, disastrous. Central bankers are using his name as an excuse to pursue destructive monetary policies. They have focused on what they believe is an attempt to end deflationary policies, following Friedman's ideas that the Great Depression was caused primarily by deflationary pressures, that the central bank made mistakes, that they allowed a collapse in the money supply. And so they're pretending that that is a substitute for logical understanding of how economies work. So they keep depressing interest rates. And what has happened, in a sense, is that in pursuing these monetary policies, they have really brought fiscal policy and monetary policy in much tighter connection than ever before. So what we see is that monetary and fiscal policy has become a sort of a corrupted version of Keynesianism and monetarism, meaning that governments are encouraged to spend beyond their means to support it through increased debt, and the low interest rates make it irresistible for politicians to borrow more. And really, in many ways, this sort of destructive trend in monetary policy began with the Japanese bubble economy collapsing in the end of the 1980s and early 90s, where Japan became the first country in the world where they drove interest rates down to zero and then into negative nominal territory, while expanding budget deficits interminably. So Japan has the highest level of debt to GDP ratio of any country in the world. Now, they've been able to get away with that primarily because they generate enough tax revenues in Japan, because of the industrialized economy, a rich economy, where they are able to repay the interest on the debt. Now, Greece, for example, the reason Greece ran into difficulties some years back is that people looked and said, well, they don't generate enough tax revenues to be able to repay the interest, never mind the principal on the debt. So they had put Greece in an unfortunate position where they couldn't roll over their debt at German interest rates any longer, which is what the euro was allowing, that they were able to borrow in the same way that Germany could. And then eventually people said, well, you can't repay the debt, and we won't loan you money unless you pay a higher interest rate. Now, what I fear is that with all the central banks in the world following the lead of Japan, going back to the early 1990s, Japan's economy has not recovered their position that they had in the end of the 1980s, even today, despite lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy, creating budget deficits to stimulate the economy. Well, we need to lower interest rates more. It didn't work, and the deficit wasn't big enough. So interest rates went lower, the deficits got larger, the interest rate went lower, and they never gave up. And this is what happened in much of the West. They followed this flawed, obvious failure of result of what they were predicting and anticipating, but they followed it anyway. Why? Because it served the interests of the political class, the bureaucrats. They love the idea that they can spend more. So that's where we are today. Now, how do we get out of it? This is terrifying. What we know is that the up until this moment, many people have been deluded, an illusion has been created that central banks actually controlled interest rates. And that's primarily because they were all doing the same thing at the same time. So everybody was moving, following the Fed, the U.S. central bank, that was following the model of the Japanese that failed, but they kept going. Now, once central bank policies become unsynchronized, they begin to move in different directions. For example, the United States is beginning to promise to allow interest rates to go back up. And the Europeans are going, no, we're not ready yet. Now, once you have this decoupling, this lack of synchronizations, then everything starts to come undone. The accumulation of global debt is at least 4 times the global stock market capitalization. So the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the global debt market, the bond markets. And as everyone might know, the movement of interest rates and bond prices is inverse, so that when interest rates go down, bond prices rise. So now we have interest rates at historically low levels that means that bond prices are at historically high levels. So if interest rates go up and bond prices come down, then people holding those bonds, unless they hold them to maturity, will experience a capital loss. So when there is an expectation that interest rates will rise, this will increasingly lead to a sell-off of bonds, which itself will push up interest rates, which will encourage a sell-off of bonds, which will push up interest rates. Sooner or later, there'll be a panic. There'll only be sellers and no buyers, and interest rates will go very rapidly to double digits. That's where you have a global recession. And they put us in this situation. It was avoidable. The rising interest rates didn't cause the problem. The lowering of the interest rates caused the problem. If they never artificially interfered with the interest rates and allowed interest rates to be determined by market processes, time preference, and all these kind of natural phenomena, we would not be in this situation of enormous global instability and a fragility that was created by central banks. Now, who will be blamed? The market. The market will be the messenger. It will be the mechanism by which these adjustments take place. But it won't be the central bankers. It won't be Alan Greenspan. It won't be the governor of the Bank of China or the Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank. People say it's the market. We need to stop the market giving us bad news. So I think we're in a very dangerous situation with respect to monetary policy.
Well, it would be history repeating again, right? Because we've seen this thing happening in the Great Depression, at least. But now we have the crypto revolution. So some people say we haven't just seen the beginning of it, although we know the saga of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies.
Ethereum,
so how do you square all this into the credit expansion story and into the monetary policy or the situation of money all around the world?
Yeah.
You know, we have fiat money, so we have money that are managed and monopolized by central banks. And okay, so let's talk about the two phenomena.
Yeah.
Can we
I'm a
relate
great
them?
enthusiast for the concept of cryptocurrencies, and I saw it as the best case scenarios could be competing currencies. That is the demonopolization of the money supply in the hands of central banks, or return to some standard, a commodity standard of some form. Of course, the most familiar would be gold or silver, but that's not going to happen because they have to agree to it. They have to implement it. The very people, the criminals that are overseeing these terrible policies, they have to be the ones to initiate it. They're not going to listen to me. So then I saw cryptocurrencies. Well, that's a third possibility. Or private banking, free banking would be another possibility. So that's four. But again, it's not going to happen. So I said, well, crypto is something that's out of their hands. They didn't anticipate it. They're too stupid. They're stuck in their sort of their own world. They weren't thinking about how people would react. So the private market, private initiatives, they're coming up with a solution, as we always see. So I was very optimistic, and I remain guardedly optimistic that I still think it's a good solution, it's a good reaction. However, governments can control access to the web, they can control access to electricity, they can control access to our access to the crypto market. So there's that danger.
Yeah, first of all, the banks, of course, because
Yeah.
they control the interface between fiat money and
Yeah, exactly.
cryptocurrency.
So it's not such a clean, it's not easy to, now, and the other thing is that it's interesting that gold has not gone into a bubble as it has in the past. And I think that has to do with the fact that my father's generation had lived either very close to a gold standard, or even in my case, we had silver dollars that we circulated. So people up to my generation, understood these sort of standards, and the possession of it still is kind of like, wow, it made sense to them because they knew stories about people in Germany that had been able to buy a mansion or a villa with a gold coin or something. So physical gold kind of was understandable. And I actually recently, for a variety of reasons, nothing to do with anything, but I sold my physical gold recently, but because of family moving, and I thought it would get lost in the shuffle. So it was nothing to do with economics or ideology. It was just a practical thing. But I think people have this sort of allergy to I mean, physical gold means you've got to protect it in some way, or it could be stolen or lost or whatever. So it hasn't developed the price effect on gold from the expansion, the inflation of currencies and credit hasn't gone into gold, but it has gone into cryptocurrencies, as well as property, stocks, and bonds. So what happened is that in my father's day, the financial instruments were probably more limited than they are now. For example, crypto was not there. So people that might have been holding gold now are into crypto. Mm-hmm. And I think the same mentality, because
they talk about Bitcoin or other currencies as the new gold, right? So, or the digital gold.
Exactly, and it's more transferable.
So you think this is the case?
I think so. I think it's partly that. So what you have to think about is that the monetarists have only one model to understand the effect of the inflation of the money supply, and that's consumer prices, the CPI. And this is what's led central bankers to pursue these disastrous policies. They kept looking at consumer prices. They're not moving. We're doing the right thing. Milton Friedman told us that. If the monetary policy is causing increases in price inflation, we need to stop. And it was absent. Why? Because monetarists don't understand this, but Austrians do. There's other channels. It can go into asset prices. That's where we get bubbles. The monetarists say, we don't cause bubbles. It's you, it's consumers. It's because you're paying these higher prices. It's irrational behavior. It's got nothing to do with us. So asset prices could be property, bonds, stocks, crypto. Okay.
Also, when you have a parallel increase in productivity, so you have more goods on the market.
Yeah. At the same time, or the deflationary effect of China, which is the increased productivity story. So all of this was going on, and monetarists can't understand any of that. I mean, their model doesn't incorporate that. The Austrians have a much better grasp of that, and they have been, I think, very clear about what we can expect from these disastrous monetary policies. So crypto is one way out, but I think it's also in a bubble, partly because of money's got to go somewhere. The liquidity's going to find, it's like water, it finds its own level.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, the fact that we have crypto since 2011, right? So it didn't pass the bubble bursting and recession and maybe depression test. So we have to see what happens there. But anyway, so the whole question is not about the price or its quotation, but rather from an institutional point of view, if we can see it as an exit, as a way for the existing monetary and credit and banking framework to as an exit point from this
absolutely
from this
hopefully
framework. Okay, so let's talk about another subject, another big subject, and since we haven't seen each other for at least 2 years, let's talk about what kept us from meeting in person, and of course it's the whole pandemic, so the pandemic and the pandemic response. So we have
It's the latter. It's the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's a policy response to
okay. So
to something that was called a pandemic.
let's talk about it in the context of again. So we can connect it with the whole credit expansion policy because it credit expansion and inflation goes by leaps and bounds. Usually, you have this sort of expansionary policy that is prompted by emergencies. We know that with each emergency we had the central banks coordinatingly injecting liquidity into markets, and this was so the pandemic was no exception. So this is their response.
Sure.
We have the concept of Higgs, the concept of the ratchet. So the ratchet effect with emergencies, you have this sort of increase in statist policies, and they never go back.
Yeah.
So
They never give them up.
so we had with money we had the same story once the pandemic hit, and then not only that. So let's talk about that and what happened to us and what should have happened or what should not have happened.
Well, I was living in Asia when the first SARS episode occurred in '92, I think it was, and it was less contagious but more deadly. And they tried much of the same thing. Tried to terrify people, and of course, without social media, it was much more difficult to spread the word. So the reaction was kind of like, people went on with their lives, and which they should have done, because as we saw, the SARS epidemic that was so terrifying at the moment didn't play out. Same with MERS and some others. So I was a bit skeptical when we encountered this new SARS virus. So in March of 2020, I was in Thailand. All of my other aspects of life plans were canceled or postponed, eventually canceled. So I began reading, having a certain depth of curiosity and not having much better things to do other than run on the beach and in the mountains. So I read about it and I said, it killed the elderly, and it was a respiratory virus. So there we are. I said, what? So, okay, that's what we have here. So what should you do? You should isolate the elderly, the people who have immunocompromised, and treat it as a respiratory virus. So respiratory virus is kind of like a tree. They all have some different aspects. Some have this kind of the green. They're green all the year. They fall off. The leaves fall off, but they're still trees. And respiratory virus, like anything else, is pretty much the same. So that's what we know now. But it took us 2 years to know that and to begin to respond as if that were something that should influence our behavior. Instead, what do? Instead of isolating, one of the responses initially was that it would be unfair to isolate the elderly. So let's be fair and isolate everybody. Now, what kind of stupidity is that? This isn't. Now, so so-called liberal democracies follow the model of an autocratic, dictatorial, Leninist regime in Beijing to implement the same kind of arbitrary policies detached from science, from medicine, and from any kind of just sort of good sense. Now, other people who were less curious than me were prone to being terrified by the propaganda. So we had, over the last couple of years, the most extensive use of psychological operations by government against their people, to keep them afraid, to keep them away from any kind of therapeutic treatments, because they promised a vaccine that would solve everything. And that was the way it was sold. Don't look at hydrochloroquine because that might work. And if it works, then the vaccine won't be useful to us. They had to denounce ivermectin. They had to denounce anything that had to do with a therapeutic treatment. And the force of all the public health agencies was against any. Now, it may well be clear, now it may be clear that hydrochloroquine or ivermectin don't work. But you would have thought that if you really wanted to save lives, you would try everything at that moment, not whenever the vaccine becomes available. There's something really ugly about that. It could be a conspiracy. I don't believe that. It could be groupthink. I suspect that's what happens. That because they were denouncing anybody that went against the narrative, everybody was afraid to do otherwise. And meanwhile, citizens are captive to this. In fact, the British government relied upon the military psyops, psychological operation, and to help formulate the policies to frighten their citizens into submission. This is in a liberal democracy with a historical sort of track record of protecting citizens and human liberties. This is unbelievable. Now, but this is the nature. There are two things going on here. Politicians want power and resources. Crises give them access to both. Because what they do is they manipulate the narrative so that citizens give up their human liberties and they give up resources. So the loss of resources was through deficit spending, so that you lose resources in the future because you have to repay that debt with interest, so that future taxpayers will be penalized for that. Giving up human liberties is being forced to stay home, to wear a mask when they're ineffective in a respiratory virus. It's a respiratory virus. It was known at that time. Respiratory viruses are spread by aerosols, that masks are ineffective. Now, if we were in this room, or maybe a smaller room, and you were infected, it might be possibly somewhat useful if both of us were masked. But in ventilated areas, it's ineffective. It's unimportant. It's not.
Yeah, and even inside with this sort of simple masks, it would be like 15 minutes before you get infected.
So, but the whole story was, again, from the beginning, it's ventilation. Masks have nothing to do with ventilation. Ventilation is having the air move around you, having an open window, putting in a system that circulates the air. That was what we didn't need social distancing. We didn't need masking. We needed sensible public policies that instructed people with good advice. They gave them bad advice, and they punished people who went against it. I haven't changed my understanding or my ideas about how to react to this policy since March of 2020. I mean, I think I have more information. I've read a lot more. You know, I read about the therapeutics and all these different things. I tried to be more educated about viruses and immunology and the immune system. That was the other thing. Natural immunity will not work in this particular respiratory virus, even though they were effective in every other one and throughout history. Yeah. Asymptomatic transmission for this particular respiratory virus is a problem, although they never were before throughout history.
Yes.
Everything went to support the narrative.
Yeah. So we had first the whole lockdown, etatism or statism, or explosion of authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the vaccine came, again,
A new level.
irrespective of the effectiveness of the vaccine, we had the obligation to have the vaccine, and a new wave of restrictions or impositions that are so far away from a liberal response, right? So.
Well, the one thing that's really important in that is that in a liberal perspective, people who provide you with a good or a service must be accountable, at least within a contractual arrangement or in terms of damages that are caused by that. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies were given by most governments an immunity against what was and still is an experimental vaccine. This was the largest medical experiment in the history of mankind. The trials, I mean, of course, they told us that there were trials beforehand with 40,000 people or whatever, but the fact that most governments have not authorized, I mean, they haven't approved, they've authorized the use, but they haven't approved, saying that, well, these are purely safe and effective, and we have enough evidence. If there was enough evidence, they would have approved them. They approved the Pfizer virus in the United States under somewhat dubious circumstances in terms of the particularity of the vaccine itself. It's a long story, but this is remarkable. Now the lockdowns, you needed to convince people that asymptomatic transmission was possible. Now, in I think it was March of 2020, one of the World Health Organization officials was interviewed in which she said, asymptomatic transmission of respiratory viruses, I think the term was extremely rare or very rare, something to that effect. Within 24 hours, science dictated that she reverse that. How's that possible? She said, well, I misspoke. What I said yesterday was not correct. And this becomes, now it had to be that in order to get people to social distance and to lock down. If you didn't have, I mean, that was a key point. And again, this is what alerted me very early on. I went, how could we overturn science? 40 years or 50 years of science and medicine about respiratory viruses in 24 hours. How is that possible? But it was done. And she made apologies, and so that became the narrative. That made me very alert to what was going on. I never bought into the nonsense about washing hands. Wash your hands and sing a song because it's a respiratory virus. It's in the air. It's not on your hands. If you sneezed in my hand, I would have to rub it into my eye. It's impossible. People were forced to wear rubber gloves. They put on hazmat suits. This was insane. They were handling dead bodies with hazmat suits in Italy. Now, the last time I read anything about it, dead people don't respire. That is, they can't expel viruses. You have a hazmat suit on. They use that as images to terrify people. And they continued well into, I would say, into 2021, because in some countries where they were still trying to justify these draconian measures, they still did that crap. I mean, it was insane. And again, the lack of curiosity of the population, and maybe the belief that the experts know better than I do or you do. And anyway, why would you listen to Lingle? He's an economist. He lives on Bali. He's not a medical professional. Why should, and where's Dr. Fauci? He's this guy with this deep training. He's a bureaucrat. He's not a physician or scientist any longer. He hasn't been one for years. His role is giving out money for research. His role is giving out salary increases. He's a bureaucrat who worked and was trained maybe in the distant past, but he's had no clinical experience. He relies not upon his own knowledge, but just like me, being able to read through the literature. So he's no better able to interpret that because he's not in the clinic. He's not doing medical research. Whenever his name might have appeared on scientific journal papers, it was just because he was the director of that agency, and it was good for their career if his name appeared on it. He probably read through it, and then signed it. Okay. The guy's he's a fraud. He's a bureaucrat. The other thing that I think libertarians or liberal should have understood, there's no such thing as public health. There's only human health, and that's individual. If you run your understanding of the world, I mean, you're a collectivist. If you're thinking about public health, you're no better than a central planner. Okay, so everybody that accepted public health declaration or the World Health Organization declarations, you were taken advantage of, because what's important is human beings, not some abstract collective, the public, the people, the masses. This is nonsense. Society. This is
but
nonsense.
Of course, it was very difficult because almost everywhere we do not have a free market in health,
Yeah.
and that was,
Yeah.
I guess, the tail that
Yeah.
wagged the whole dog.
Sure.
Because we had this health socialism,
Yeah.
And because it was perceived that an increase in infections would put pressure on the health systems, and because the health systems were not flexible enough to,
Yeah.
to deal with the problem, then they decided that they would punish society in order not to
Yeah.
strain the
Yeah.
the health system.
But you
So
know what?
basically,
yeah.
we became all Chinese
Mhm.
2 years ago. But the question is, are we still all Chinese now? We know that China is very Chinese now.
Yeah.
They have
More
a,
so. Yeah.
They have a new.
They locked down Shanghai.
New wave, yes. Whereas they.
Inevitably. It's a respiratory virus. It's the same in New Zealand. New Zealand had a zero COVID policy, and they went along like this. Oh, they're the exemplar. They're
Yeah.
Now they
And it happened quite late.
Yep.
It
And-
was
but-
the same
and
in
the-
Australia.
The good and bad news for them is that maybe they got a less virulent, less deadly variant,
Yeah.
but they had no natural immunity because they were isolated. Whereas other countries that acquire natural immunity along the way, they probably have a better record at the moment. Now, a teaching moment here about the National Health Services is that they could not expand the intensive care units that might be required by really chronic cases. But in the United States, where the hospitals were private, well, they just may open up more intensive care units because there's money in it. That is, the willingness and the ability, either through insurance or personal, to pay, they open up more. But we don't have the budget in the national health. Well, how do we get more? And there's no market. There's nobody selling more intensive care unit facilities. In the United States, it's there. You call it, and it's there. So, although the U.S. had many more deaths, partly because we're obese, we have lifestyles that made us more vulnerable to these, especially the earlier, deadlier variants. Healthy people, younger people, not so much. But most of the deaths, of course, as everyone knows now, were in the immunocompromised and the elderly, which I told you I knew in March of 2020. If we'd isolated them and given them good information, say, look, you can go out if you want, but it may be deadly for you. But we encourage you to act much more prudently. Or in the elderly homes where elderly people live, you would do your best to keep them isolated. You would restrict access to them and so on because they're quite vulnerable. So it's really, it could have been different, much different.
So how do you perceive the situation now? Are we, is the ratchet in full,
Yeah.
blocked at the new
I'm afraid so.
level, or
If you
did
look
we go
at,
back? I mean, the perspective here in Romania, where we are now, is that things have more or less come back to normal. And it's very interesting because we still have influenza and infections. We still have people with problems, but it seems that it has gone away from public conscience, and that the state doesn't push. It doesn't. It stopped all the propaganda, and maybe also the next subject that I want to discuss with you has something to do with it, the war and so on.
okay, like
What's the overview, your perspective at what happens globally?
the most destructive long-term effect of people accepting COVID policies without questioning them and submitting to this repressive authority is the destruction of trust. One of the great benefits of a market economy is that it helps create this idea of trust among people in terms of their voluntary arrangements. And what happened is that these COVID policies made people think you are possibly the carrier of a dangerous pathogen. I want to be away from you. The market says, you are someone who could be my customer or my employer or someone to help me, someone that I could find mutual advantage in. This separation is really the most destructive thing. And this is why I'm terrified that the first sign of a new variant or whatever, people will go back into that, because that fear tactic was so effective. If you look at Australia, which had some of the most repressive policies, at one point at least 80% of the population was accepting of it. They said, yes, do whatever you need to do, please. You think they're going to, they'll accept another round of it. And the more dangerous part of this is that all of these techniques and these repressions will be used in the name of climate action. They couldn't frighten us into believing in climate change, but now it'll be much easier. Before, people said, but look, it's the middle of April and it's beautiful weather. I don't believe that bullshit. So I'm not accepting, all these. But now they set the stage. And this is what makes me pessimistic. So we destroyed trust to their advantage, and we've created the possibility for people to accept really, if you would be forced, if you began to believe that climate change was an existential threat for mankind, not just for your personal safety or that of your family, and you accepted all this nonsense about COVID, what are you going to do when you say, okay, we've been telling you for a long time about climate change, you didn't believe us. I think it's going to be easier for them to get away with that. And that really worries me.
Mm-hmm. Can we do something about it?
I'm not sure. The only thing that gets us out of problems is always private initiative. Governments don't solve problems, they create problems, and they multiply them. The private sector, the tendencies are to attack problems, solve them, and at least mitigate them. You can't maybe get rid of them, but you can improve them. Governments always make them worse and make them worse. So until we get to the place where we can see an expansion of the scope of human liberty, where individual initiatives are at play, I'm less optimistic.
Okay. So then let's go to a brighter subject. Let's talk about the war and especially sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
So I want your economist opinion on what's going on now, especially with economic or trade policy response that the West has to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's talk about
Okay, a general framework for this is to quote Randolph Bourne, who said, "War is the health of the state." Now, so it's an opportunity, again, it's in a sense like a crisis, where you can extract more freedoms from people. They're maybe volunteer for the military, or they're conscripted and they're less resistant. More resources go to the state and so on. So it's a real problem. The second part of it is that war propaganda is the worst of all propagandas. So, and my sympathies are broadly with the Ukrainians. Many Ukrainian friends, I often go there. And many of my Russian friends are also broadly supportive of the Ukraine because they're libertarians and they have a perspective on this, similar perspective. But because of the nature of war propaganda, we have to disbelieve everything. I often tell people is that if there's something on the internet that I want to believe, I challenge it. That's what I challenge the most. Because I don't want to be drawn into somebody else's propaganda or their lies or fraud. So like with Buka, it's possible. I mean, governments are capable of murdering their own citizens. And that's a possibility, that Buka, this massacre, or it could be that they found dead soldiers from either side, put them in civilian clothes, and threw them in the street. These are possible. I think it's very likely that the Russians did it, but I'm not sure. I wasn't there. I didn't see who pulled the trigger. It could have been a Ukrainian who wanted to kill his creditor, or an ethnic, somebody he had disagreed with, or somebody that he thought was, who knows what happened. The blown up buildings, I don't know who fired that shell. I'm happy to believe the Russians did it, but I don't know. So, extreme skepticism about any particular, remember the ghost of Kiev?
Yes.
This was,
Yeah.
well, nobody talks about that anymore. It was complete fabrication. But everybody wanted to believe it. I didn't. I wanted to believe it, but I didn't believe it. I said, no, that's nonsense. It doesn't. But everybody, okay, now, so Buka, it was a massacre by the Russians. I don't really know. Just like I didn't know about, well, I did know about the ghost of Kiev. That was nonsense. I knew it from the outset. Buka, I can imagine the Russians are capable of doing that. But the motivation is a little bit vague to me, but anyway. So, okay, now, come to sanctions.
But let me just interrupt you here to notice that we have all this talk for several years about fake news and
Yeah,
let's combat fake
sure.
news and so on.
Yeah.
And here comes the war, and
Yeah.
you have this propaganda, which is, if this isn't the mother of fake news,
Yeah.
I don't know what.
That's
is.
war propaganda. Yeah, war propaganda is the mother of fake news.
It's crazy.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you cannot believe anything
yeah.
anymore.
Exactly.
It's the most reasonable thing is to just ignore it, ignore all the news until a few days pass, and you have some more sources that could check things.
Yeah.
Although I agree with you that probably months and years must pass before we know something for sure. Maybe we'll never know.
We'll never know. I think we'll never know.
Yeah.
Now,
but one thing. So let's.
well, let me wait. Let me establish my bona fides on this.
Yeah. Okay.
A month ago or so, I was talking with Tom Palmer. He's living in Thailand where I was at the time. And he said, I'm going to Ukraine, come with me. And I thought, he didn't give me any background. We weren't talking about, let's go to Ukraine and do this and this and this. Now, if he had, I probably would have gone with him. And he's been going back and forth from Poland, taking supplies. And that would be something I would have been.
So you mean after the beginning of the war?
Yeah, yeah. So he was there until recently, going back and forth from Poland. Now, so I support the Ukrainians to that extent because I know many people there. So it's not that I'm supporting Putin or anything.
You know,
I'm just
what
saying
happens
that.
here,
Yeah,
you're an American.
yeah,
This part of the world, for most Americans, is some remote place.
yeah.
They are not so emotionally involved as we are here.
Yeah,
We have a past history of
Sure.
Russian aggression. So in the collective memory, we have all these stories about what the army did to us, to Romanians, to other peoples around here. So there is this huge animosity towards Russia, which first of all. Second, and this is why I want to make it very clear, and I'm very careful with this all the time, to condemn the invasion that happens.
Yeah.
Because it's clear that even from a libertarian point of view, where you do not believe in the state, and you do not believe in this identification or in this identification of the state with the nation, right? So the society and the nation is not the same thing with the state, and we have to make clear that it's the Russian state that attacks the Ukrainian state, and that's in itself maybe we have to discuss it from a libertarian point of view, um, in the way the realpolitik guys discuss about it. But it's clear that to the extent that the state attacks private property, private businesses, private and population, and it maims and it kills them, that's clearly and netly to be condemned. So we condemn the invasion. I condemn the invasion, and I want to make it clear all the time, because a lot of times when
I don't even do that, because it's, to me, it's so obvious. So in a way, if you're making that claim, I think when people say, I know Hitler was a bad guy, but. So now I think, he's going to make an apology for Hitler. So I don't make those claims. It's just like, Russians are at fault. And you don't have to say anything more.
But how many Russians, all the Russians, should we hit them? And let's go into the sanctions issue now.
Okay, sanctions. Okay, sanctions are a complicated thing. From a public choice perspective, in terms of understanding the incentives that politicians or bureaucrats and political parties are affected by, in a situation like this, the pressures on them in order to be either continue to be popular, to possibly being reelected, is you must do something. Because people are outraged or feel helpless personally. So you have to do something. So the politicians got really two choices: sanctions or go to war. Now, if that's a binary choice, sanctions are my choice, because war is not ever going to be my choice. Now, the next question is, will they be effective? Well, it depends on so many things, because it could be that sanctions make things worse. That is, it hardens the position of the target, Putin, the Russians. So the Russians hate the West more. They feel more detached from civilization than ever before, in much the same way that the U.S. embargo of Japan before World War II drove the Japanese to an even more aggressive positions, especially towards the U.S. So sanctions may be effective, but in a way you don't want. The impact of the sanctions is also important. It may be that the cost of the person imposing the sanction becomes very high. How much are people willing to absorb in order to isolate Russia? Now, it's quite clear that many Europeans, they say, well, how do we do without Russian oil and gas? Because look, well, you know what country in Europe is doing without oil and gas right now? Ukraine. They have no access.
I know that the gas transits
But that's been closed for a long time. They have to they're running a war. I mean, you think Russia's giving them oil and gas? Hell no.
I really don't know.
They're not.
Why would you? That I know for sure that the
gas line was cut off long ago.
That's not what I know.
Yeah.
I know that it transfers gas towards
and
Europe. But I don't know if that particular pipeline is, and the access of the Ukrainians to it. I mean, how would you sell or give? I mean, they would give, because if the Ukrainians can take gas out of that, they're not going to pay the Russians, right? I know for sure that the
West and they could block it so that it didn't go on to Europe.
I know for sure that the West so that the
well, anyway, okay, never mind. That's a detail that neither of us have full information about. So okay, but anyway, so the point of that was, if I'm correct, and you may be, but if I'm correct, there's a high cost to the Ukrainians of the sanctions against Russia not to buy from them, and they're willing to take that. Okay. And whereas the rest of Western Europe is not. Of course, they're not directly involved, but the point is, sanctions will impose a high cost on the person who is imposing them. And it's a cost. At what point will that cost be too high for people to say, okay, it's not working, or it's not doing what we want, so let's give it up? So there's a real interesting question about that. But, and so you have to ask these questions. And then you look at history to see how effective are sanctions. I lived in South Africa when there were lots of sanctions against South Africa and isolation and so on. It didn't really change, didn't cause regime change. The regime change in South Africa was based upon the internal and contradictions of, you know, and the domestic issues, not what would the rest of the world thought or cared about. So I've never been convinced that sanctions.
Can we find a country where sanctions actually worked?
No, because even like Cuba, I mean, the Americans are supposed to have boycotted or embargoed Cuba, but we sell most of their agricultural products come from the United States. I mean, nobody even talked. Most people don't know it, especially since about 2000. We've been selling them lots of things, but there's this embargo on Cuba. No, there's not. Why? Well, because the political power and influence of the agricultural community in the United States said, yeah, it's a market for us. I mean, you know, come on, guys, let us go in there because, you know, they're buying from everybody else. They're going to do it anyway. Why should we be kept out of it? So, no, I can't think of any example, but I'm not a student of the history of that. I used to, when I lived in South Africa, I was interested.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked at it. At that time, I would have said fairly categorically, I see no evidence of the effectiveness of it.
So I find it really like very characteristic of the state to use sanctions because this is what the state does.
Yeah.
It usually hurts non-combatants.
Yeah.
So sanctions hurt your own people,
Yeah.
your own consumers, your own companies, and also the target population.
Sure.
But most of the times it would not hit the state directly, the aggressive state. It would hit the economy and the population. And from this point of view, I'm of the different position that I think it would make more sense what the West does now to send weaponry to the defending population and state. It makes more sense to me to to have this sort of targeted response than to use sanctions that would make the West less efficient, less productive, less capable of defending others and itself. With no result, and hitting people that are not non-combatant. I mean, we know that sanctions can be very hurtful. I mean, they're not effective in changing, in doing regime change, but they are effective in making populations suffer. Yes, from hunger, from
deprivation, higher prices. But the thing is, even if if it ended Putin's regime, there would be Putin too. I mean, Russia's not going to change because Putin goes away. I mean, the sort of structures, the historical proto-imperialism, that's not going to go away.
Yeah, that's a fine point too,
historical myth of Russia.
Yeah, I think
it's not going to go away.
Yeah, maybe it's a high probability that the population that is sanctioned it will be more determined in supporting the regime than otherwise. Yeah. So that's another point against.
Yeah. So, and your point about giving arms, well, why didn't Poland give up those MiGs? Because they knew, or they were afraid, that Putin would say, you're giving them these weapons. So he said, okay, we'll give them to America, we'll give them to NATO and an American air base in Germany, and then you do it. Because so at what point would that arming of the combatants be seen by the Russians as those MiGs? Okay, now you're involved because you're arming them. Now it's funny that somehow at this moment the MiGs were seen as much more threatening or more of a clear-cut thing that would be a violation. But I just saw that the Australians sent some special type of armored vehicles that were delivered to Ukraine, and somehow,
and all the anti-tank and anti-aircraft.
So but really, I mean, that's helping kill Russians just the way the MiGs would. So
military,
why?
I should say, or Russian army.
Yeah. So yeah, Russian combatants. So,
Mm.
you know, it's an interesting problem there. At some point, it could be that giving these other types of armaments could be viewed in the same sort of bright line as those MiGs.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that at least so from a libertarian point of view of the external policy and all this action of the state, the ideal is for the state to be as little active as possible.
Mhm.
So it's very hard to judge the extent to which some states help other states. I think we, so, or I would like to add the fact that the ideal thing would be to have like private efforts,
Yeah.
even in this
What
in
Tom
this
Palmer's
area.
doing. Tom Palmer's doing it.
Yeah,
raising.
I mean even in a military way. So you have mercenaries, you have private armies. It would be great to have more private army and less public
Be
involvement.
careful what you ask for, because the Wagner Group is kind of a Waffen-SS of
Yeah.
Putin that is nominally private, and
Yeah,
these
well,
guys are. But
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
armies that would be financed
Yeah.
by free markets and that would have.
I'll
free
tell you a
market in-
story about that. A friend of
Yeah.
mine has been spending a lot of time in Turkey, I had been in Turkey since the 1970s. So we know some people that had been formerly in military and intelligence and all kinds of funny places. But because of some business deals, we know these guys. But he was trying to raise private money, and he asked me if I could identify people that might, because they had 5,000 former Turkish military and maybe some current, who knows
Mhm.
how these things work. But they needed to get there. They were ready, willing, and able to go to Ukraine. Now, again, we don't know why the Ukrainian government wouldn't get involved in something like that, because Turkish soldiers, these are guys you'd want to have brought in, because these are tough people. They're people of the mountains. These are not soft urban people. Okay, now, the same thing was going on in Thailand. I think there were 3,000 Thai nationals had gone to the Ukrainian embassy to sign up as volunteers to go. They said, okay, you can go, but you pay your own airfare. Now, again, you and I might say, well, better that the Ukrainian taxpayers don't pay for that. But they're going to pay, presumably, those people when they get there. So it's, governments, we live with governments doing stuff like that all the time. But I was a little bit surprised that the Ukrainian state didn't see it in their interest to get experienced combatants from other countries to go in. And like these Turks would offset the Wagner Group in
Mhm.
terms of their capabilities, I think, in terms, at least maybe not equipment, because they're,
Well, they have the Azov battalion
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
other
well, and that,
organizations like that.
well, see,
Should we go there?
Yeah.
Should we discuss about that?
not really, I think we've run out of time, but the Azov battalion, I think it's kind of a situation of my enemies' enemies are my friends. Now these Azov guys, some of them, not all of them, had neo-Nazi, had nationalistic and maybe extreme nationalistic, which could blend or blur into a neo-Nazi kind of image. But the same is true if you look at the profile of the Wagner Group, they're the same kind of guys. Now, if you wanted to fight against the neighbor, these are the kind of guys you'd want in between you and them, even if they have ugly ideology and politics, because it's a matter of survival, and they almost enjoy doing it. I don't know the mentality of these kind of people, but that's what they do. So this is the Azov battalion, and they've been very effective, as you can see, because they have been able to resist. So this is part of what Putin tried to use. Oh, they're all Nazis. Well, they took some people, they took a group, some of which might self-identify, but they all don't. But they're all maybe ultra-nationalists. which may or may not give you, you may not be an anti-Semite. I doubt if they're anti-Slavic.
They are anti-Russian for sure.
They may be, but that's nationalism. But they're not fascists. They're not neo-Nazis or whatever. But they were able to identify certain people and their emblems and so on. And some of the, but if you look at the Wagner group, they use a Cyrillic swastika.
Mm-hmm.
The swastika the Nazis used. You can make all kinds of claims. So at the Azov Battalion, I'm willing to give broadly a pass. Maybe because of my sympathies for the Ukrainian cause. But I don't see them, and all my friends who are pushing against the Western pro-Ukraine narrative keep pointing to them and using them as an example that, you know, Ukraine is full of Nazis, of neo-Nazis. I don't buy that. But anyway, I think...
Yeah, a war crime is a war crime, and we'll see after all this fog of war is dissipated, we'll have to see what happened there.
I don't know about war crimes. War is war. If you're going to have war, you're going to have shit. And calling it a crime...
It should be minimized, right? Because
well,
we have the idea of just war, of not killing non-combatant civilians, not bombing civilians and all that.
It's psychological. We can't control psychology in that. I mean, we don't understand it. We never lived through it. I mean, if you look at these war movies that really show the ugliness of war, the bombarding and the loss of your best friend and the explosion of his body, and you can't control that. I mean, say that's a war crime. Don't do that. The rage of the moment. I mean, we put them there.
Yeah,
why wouldn't they have that rage?
On the other hand, you could not rape, mutilate.
You can't control that. I mean,
so
I know you're right. I mean, these are horrible. But to pretend that human psychology is going to say, okay, my moral standards under peacetime were that rape is punishable, and every rapist should be castrated and then hung, and you would have agreed with that. You put them in that situation. You can't control it. So look, if you're going to have war, you're going to have that stuff. So stop pretending that war crimes are war crimes. It's just war.
Yeah.
And I think this, again, it's maybe a self-righteousness and of the victor to say, you committed the war crime. Well, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were war crimes.
True that.
But we won.
True that.
We won.
And
so I stop pretending that we know. I think we should stop pretending that we know what war crimes are, because we're not fighting.
Yeah, no, but I mean, we can define a war crime.
You cannot define them. You can define them, but they are irrelevant in the heat of war.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's see if we can agree on that. So, as a military, as a soldier, you can fight against another military, against another soldiers, but you should not make collateral victims. You should not. You should try to avoid hurting civilians.
You may agree to it in training, but in war, you lose humanity in war. War has no humanity. War is killing people, and so raping them. What's the big deal about that? They're going to be dead. So I mean, if we put people in war, we've stripped them of humanity, and then we want to hold them accountable for being inhumane.
Yeah, where do we stop? Because if we go like that, we can just
just use the
atomic
you stop
bomb.
war. No, you just stop. You have to stop war. So
Yeah.
this is. I mean,
I see. Okay.
if you have war, you're going to have that. So
Okay. So what you're saying
it's
is
inevitable.
That what you're saying is that in the dynamic of it is it's so difficult to stop, right?
It's impossible.
Yeah.
Because you stripped of you. Imagine that you're in a situation where you desperately kill someone, and once you kill the first one, the second one's easy. The third, you don't even notice it, and then you become aggressive, and then you lose a sense of I'm killing a living, breathing human being. He's a father. He's a son. He's a child. I mean, it's just impossible.
Yeah.
We can't.
Okay.
You can't put people.
Yeah.
You can't put people in that situation and expect them to be otherwise.
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry to.
Yeah. No, I mean, think about it.
Led you to this.
It's
emotional
okay.
state.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful day.
Yeah.
Let's enjoy it. We had difficult subjects.
Yeah.
Monetary policy is a tragedy that we go through. We have this institution of the central bank, historical, relatively young institution, but it's clear that it creates this sort of manic, depressive environment,
Yeah.
economic
Yeah.
environment that we suffer so much through. It fuels statism. We've seen what we've been through with the COVID and now with the war. Difficult subjects. Thank you for having this time with me. Let's go and enjoy the beautiful weather outside.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Nice to see you.